Our keynote speaker today is a great pleasure for me to introduce. His name is Howard Ashcraft. He joins us today from the beautiful Bay Area, a little warmer down there, I think, on the West Coast. He's led in the development and the use of integrated project delivery in the United States, Canada, and in many other countries. Over the past decade, his team has structured over 125 pure IPD projects and worked on many highly integrated projects. He co-authored the AIACC's, and maybe Howard will explain that later, Integrated Project Delivery, a Working Definition, the AIA's IPD Guide, and the text published by Wiley earlier this year, Integrated Project Delivery. A partner in the San Francisco law firm of Hanson Bridget, he is an elected fellow of the American College of Construction Lawyers and an honorary fellow of the Canadian College of Construction Lawyers. He is also an honorary member of AIA California Council. In addition to his practice, he serves as an adjunct professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford University. Please help me welcome our great guest, Howard Ashcraft.
Thank you very much.
Have a great time, Howard.
Good morning. If you listen to the last series of speakers, there was probably one word that came up more often than any other word. Does anyone know what it was? Collaboration. Every single person talked about collaboration. The problem is how. And it turns out that there's issues that are structural issues that we'll talk about that we are focused on and actually how to make it happen. The other thing I'd do is I'd like to thank my friend Alan, who I haven't seen for a while, because I'm sure when he was talking about the younger generation, he was talking about me. So thank you very much, Alan, for that introduction. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what we've developed. And by the way, we tend to refer to the process as integrated project delivery, but what we really want to think about is integrating project delivery because it's a process that goes on and on. It also, a number of the tools apply to other project delivery methods. So don't think that if you don't have an IPD project right in front of you that you don't need to actually use this. We all need to figure out some way to collaborate. Does anyone want to have buildings that are sustainable? The answer is going to be yes. High performance, yes. Do you want to use lean process? All those require intense collaboration. So let's move back a little bit. If you look at about the last 20 plus years, and I just choose that arbitrarily, by the way, I could have chosen 40 and that would have worked as well. You go back and you find that, in fact, there's a lot of information about how, design and construction. We're jumping back and forth. If you go back about 20 years and look at some of the work that was done by the UK government, the Latham report, they actually looked at design and construction and concluded that it was fragmented, adversarial, did not use the right business model, and did not use technology well. They went forward and came up with, slides are a little out of order, but we'll make this work. They then went for, another group about 10 years later, Construction Users Roundtable, looked at the exact same issues and concluded that design and construction was fragmented, adversarial, did not use the right business models, and did not use technology well. And they came up with a prescription for what to do about it, which is pretty much on the screen. And if you actually looked at that, it would be a pretty good definition of integrated project delivery. And yes, the word collaborative is right in there again. You know, they're a little out of order. So you basically look at the UK work, a little over 20 years ago, the work done in the United States, a little over 10 years ago. We're looking at like 2006, saying exactly the same thing. But the good news is that in 2016, there was a breakthrough. The World Economic Forum put out a report, and they decided that design and construction was fragmented, adversarial, had the wrong business model, and did not use technology right. By the way, the chairman of that was from AECON out of Canada. So we then get a complete repeat, and then, of course, McKinsey, which likes to jump onto these things too, issued a report in 2017 that said exactly the same thing. So what's the point about that? If you look at the exact same time period, all those reports are being created, and look at labor productivity, you will see that it has been flat to declining in the design and construction markets. If you look at The Economist, which but for efficiency's sake, reprints the same basic report every 5 years, they come out with a report and they basically said that efficiency eludes the construction industry. So now we know that for over 20-some years, we've known what the problem was and we know what the solution is. The really interesting question is then why haven't we done it? Why haven't we done it if we know what the problem is and we know what the solution is? Part of the problem is that we've tried to use the exact same thinking that got us into the problem. I was doing a seminar at Stanford, and we were talking about some of the deficiencies in actually scheduling. And so someone said, so we need to break it down into more and more little pieces. And we went, you missed the point completely. That doesn't work. That's what we're trying to tell you. We can't use the same thing. The second thing is that we've come up with all kinds of little solutions to solve little problems. There's a lot of innovation in design and construction, but it's focused not on the system, it's focused on individual symptoms. As a result, we're tinkering. You do not transform through tinkering. So let's look at a different strategy. And the strategy we really focused on to how to make a transformative change in this industry is integration. We first focused on what do we really want to accomplish. A lot of times people say, well, everyone said collaboration. Let's collaborate. Maybe that will do something better. Let's reverse it. Let's figure out what end we want to get to and then figure out how to get there. So we decided to define a high-performance project because we basically said that's pretty much what everybody wants to achieve. Now, by the way, high performance was probably a little bit of a bad choice in terms because probably when I said that, 3/4 of people thought sustainability or energy or something like that. If you walk into a Gothic cathedral that is leaking and cold, but you feel spiritual, it's a high-performance building. It achieved the needs of the stakeholders and users. That's what it was built for. It's doing what it was designed to do. That's what we're talking about for high performance. But to define that, we decided it has to be buildable. You actually have to be able to build this thing within time. It has to be built safely, within budget. It has to be usable, meets the needs of the stakeholders and sponsors. Operable, it has to be maintainable, and has to fit in with life cycle. And then, of course, we're focusing very heavily now on it has to be sustainable as well, and spares resources, preserves the environment, and in some instances, you can actually use projects to improve the environment. So we can go even beyond. That led us to saying, well, if that's true, how do you get there? And so we started with a high-performance project, and if you actually think about every building, this building, any project, they're an integration of systems. What happens when we fragment the way we bid, build, design, is all those systems come together and they interact. They will interact. They just don't interact in a fully planned way. We need to actually have all the systems work together synergistically if we're actually going to move forward. So we said, okay, we need integrated building systems. How do you do that? Well, you actually have to have ways, and this is key for collaboration, for the vendors, the manufacturers, the specialty trades, all to be working with the designers before the design is complete. In fact, before the design is very far along. In fact, even better, before the design is started. That requires a change in the way we structure work if we're actually going to make that happen. We need to have integrated processes where people can actually do this. The next step is, okay, how are you actually going to make that? And I just mentioned we have to change the organizational pattern if we're going to get people at the right place in the right time. By the way, this first hit me, I was working very heavily with building information modeling and actually on the National Building Information Modeling Standards. And I realized that if we wanted to try to use BIM anywhere close to what the hype said we could, we needed to change our structures so that we had deep early collaboration, and I just spent 17 years telling people not to do that. Slightly embarrassing. We need an integrated organization. We need to stop thinking about companies at a project. We need to be thinking of the project as an organization, as a virtual organization by itself. And then we need a common language. We need to be able to have information that is actionable, that we can use. We need to have information that we can actually use to guide the project. That's building information modeling, but it's a lot of other things too. It's often information that's up on walls. It's information on dashboards that a management team, but it's aggregated information from the entire team. And that requires a level of collaboration and transparency, which once again is not conventional in most of the industry. There are a series of tools in this: performance metrics, production management, which you can think of as lean, integrated concurrent engineering, which is a form of really intense engineering efforts, simulation visualization coming out of BIM, and supported by an IPD agreement. That's in an optimal case. Most of the things on that slide are usable to a degree. Kind of jump ahead for a moment. A lot of people will say, can I do all this stuff without the agreement? And the answer is yes, sort of. You can do a lot of this stuff without being in a full IPD agreement. You can't do as much. And that's not just my experience, it's also what the research from the University of Minnesota says. So a lot of this is transferable, but don't use the fact that you can get some as an excuse for not trying to get all. You can get more. The problem with that prior graphic is it made it look like this is a sequential process, and it was a sequential process how we developed the concept. It's not a sequential process in execution. In execution, these things all are basically happening at exactly the same time. So the concept here in integrating project delivery is that we still have integrated systems, integrated process, integrated organization, integrated information. We're heavily using metrics to manage the project. A lot of people think collaboration means warm hugs. Collaboration is highly accountable. In fact, it's far more accountable than traditional project delivery. Something I ask my students to do is go through a set of standard construction documents, read through it, and tell me who's responsible for the success of the project. Anyone guess what the answer is? No one. The designer is responsible for design to the standard of care. The contractor is responsible for building what's designed. The owner is responsible to pay money. If I were to do a startup, create a startup right now, and I would say, by the way, I'd like you to invest. We have revenues about $500 million, and I would like you to invest in my company. We've got some really good departments. I've got a good design department. I've got a good production department. I've got a good marketing department. By the way, there is no board of directors. There is no president. There's no one who's responsible that the company actually makes a profit. But we've got some pretty good departments. Anybody want to invest in my company? That's called a construction project. That's how we design construction projects. But none of us would invest our own money if somebody came up to us on the street and offered us that opportunity. I'm going to talk about structure, because I'm a structure guy. And that's generally what I do, is structuring projects. But one of those things I want to actually let everybody remember is that IPD is a cocktail. That's a lot more fun anyway than the structure. The structure, by the way, is the glass. Because you have to have both the structure, you've got to have the right processes, you've got lean processes, Lean Construction Canada is leading some of that. You have to have focus on collaboration, continuous improvement in technology. All those things have to happen to optimize project delivery. The problem that we focused on a lot is the fact that structure drives a lot of things, and a lot of people don't realize it. Structure is a lot like gravity. You don't see it, it's all around you, and it has a tremendous impact. How many of you have ever had a project, as an example, where essentially you have capital expenditure budget and operational, CapEx and OpEx. And so I'm talking to the owners, but others. And you say, I've got a great idea that's going to cost some money, but it will produce life cycle benefits. And whoever is responsible for the CapEx budget says, If it doesn't cost any money, maybe we can do it, but I can't spend any of my budget to improve life cycle cost. So by structuring the financing of the project or the building into two pieces, we inherently create lower performing buildings. That's a structural problem. But most people don't push at structural problems because one of the problems with structure, there's an old French phrase that I've always liked, which is a fish is the last to discover water. If you're in the fishbowl, you don't even know you're in their water. It's all around you. You can't live without it. It's affecting everything you do, and you don't see any of it. That's the structure we've currently, because most of the things I've talked about, I grew up with in design and construction and never questioned, at least for about 15 years, never questioned. Let's question a few things. The traditional approach that you have if you receive bill from a designer, by the way, as a lawyer, my business model is equally screwed up. But if you receive a bill from a designer, for instance, what is the unit that you're paying for? Time, hours. Now, within every hour, there is profit embedded in, that's in the way they calculate hours. How then do you think a designer makes more profit? They sell more hours. What does that have to do with value? You're buying the wrong thing. You're also creating an incentive. By the way, this applies to any time you have markups. It applies to labor costs in construction. It applies to materials cost. Anytime you have embedded profit, what you essentially are saying, the more I can sell, the more profit I make. Now, does anyone have any estimate of how much, based upon some research, there is waste, basically activity that occurs in design and construction that produces no value that an owner would want to buy? Do we have an optimist or a pessimist in the group? 40%. We have 40%. Not far off, a little optimistic. Anybody else? 50. You know, that's probably pretty close. The research bounces around on the number. It doesn't really matter. If it was 25, it's a huge number. McKinsey estimated that if you got rid of the waste in design and construction, you could actually pay for half of the world's infrastructure needs just out of the waste. Half of the world's total infrastructure needs. So if you've created a system that's basically baked the waste in, you stop and think that most of the firms have been around here for a while, they've been profitable for a while, who paid for it? This is what I'm talking about. It's baked into the system. We don't even see the inefficiency because it's baked in. Let's make a change. Let's go to a margin incentive. Let's say instead of having profit based on hours, we agree what the profit should be for any party in a project as a fixed amount of money. Now, if they can deliver for fewer number of hours, there's a margin incentive. You've now created an incentive for actual having efficiency. You've also created the possibility, because now if you have everybody starts off with fixed profits, you can move work from one person to the other because you're no longer basing profit based on the hours, so you can adjust to the best person to do the work. Why have 4 people put in hangers when one person can do the job? One company can do the job. Why have 4 sets of scissor lifts when in fact one set would do just fine? There's a lot of efficiencies you can now create. You can also look at contingency completely differently if you change this one structural element. Let's look at some other structural elements. We traditionally create a system where you can actually optimize an individual outcome. I have lots of projects where someone will, in fact, there was a project in Canada not too long ago. Someone was talking about delivering an RFP, and they said, let's use this as in one of our examples. And someone said, don't do that. And they said, why? It was a great project for us. And I said, yeah, but not for anybody else. How can you have that, where you have a great project for one person, they make money, and the project fails? But in fact, that's exactly what you do in traditional project delivery. If you just think about the fight for interstitial space in a laboratory or a hospital, a classic example of where there's conflict that provides zero value to anyone. So we can change that. We can basically say that all profits are based upon project outcome together. At that point in time, there's no point to having fighting. There's no point to having finger pointing. In fact, you have to solve problems together if you want to maximize your profit outcome. By the way, historically, people make more money doing this. So we actually create a project structure like this. So you start off with a fixed profit as a structural item, and then you say the profit goes up or down based on project outcome. A very different structural model. The next thing you do is you change whether or not you can basically escape the system. In a traditional project, does anyone here do hard bid public work? Somebody must. Differing site condition, okay. Let's say there's an error in the plans and specifications. What does the contract require you to do first? I'm sure you've memorized the contract. Come on, tell me that. You memorized it. Someone spent a lot of time making that thing. What do they have to do first? First thing, if they hit an error, they run into a problem, what's the first thing they have to do under the contract? Give notice. And if they fail to give notice, what happens? You lose the opportunity to make a claim. So we've created a contract structure which says if you run into a problem, the first thing you should do is start the claims process. It's exactly what it says. Now, if you wanted a high-performance team, what would be the first thing you would want them to do when they ran into a problem? Solve it. So I should write the contract which says, if you run into a problem, period, please solve it, period. We don't quite do that, but if you start off with that concept of change the structure, fixed profit, profit-based going up and down, and then you say that there are very few opportunities for change orders and very few opportunities for claims. You close the box. What you're saying is if you don't solve the problem, your profit goes down. Guess what? When you do that, problem resolution speeds up drastically. Not only that, once this sinks in change of structure, we find that trades are now interested in design intent, not just what's put on the drawings, because they want to make sure that when they're in the field, they're executing the right thing and the problem doesn't even happen. It's a structural change. There are a whole bunch of structural changes. I wanted to focus on a couple of them to show you how profound changing structure can be. But one of the first things we do is we try to get early involvement of key participants, and that's everyone who has a significant impact on the project. I've pushed this for years and years and years, and it turns out when the data came out, I was wrong. It's even earlier than I thought. I'll show some of that data a little later. That drives innovation and creativity, efficiency, and effort. Tons of research to support that. We use joint project management. In an IPD project, by the way, I can tell you who's responsible for project outcome. I can tell you by name. That's why it's so much more accountable. It's usually the project management team, and those people are identified. Joint sharing of risk and reward. We use joint validation to make sure we have alignment on what those targets should be. Shared pain grain. What we're shooting for is high-performance project delivery, but we're also shooting for something else. We're shooting for reliable high-performance project delivery, because all of you have been in a CM at risk, a design build, even a design build bid build project that was really, really good. It's just not very common. What traditional project delivery is, it tends to look like the graphic on the left. The ball is being balanced there, but it's really easy for it to fall off. And when it falls off, there's nothing to keep it coming back. We want to create a system that's homeostatic. Essentially, if something goes wrong, it wants to roll to the center, because that's where you make the most money for everybody. And it tends to self-correct. This changes, once you've got this structural change, you now find there's a complete mindset change going on, because under a traditional approach, enforcement of promises, we turn over to a third party, judge, jury, arbitrator, whatever it's going to be. We tell someone else to tell us what the answer is. By the way, that drives a lot of what you see in construction contracts are all basically written for that third party. They're not written for the parties. They're to make it easier for that person to make a decision. That's why they're there. Notice provisions, that's why they're there. There's a lot of other provisions, the termination default provisions, that's why they're there. They're not to help the parties, they're to help the judge. External adjudication. If you move to a relational approach, You now want to focus on internal adjustment because you're focusing on actually how you modify as the project goes on to achieve the highest performance. The definition of success in traditional projects is compliance. I did exactly what you told me to do. Sorry, it failed. Sorry, it failed. How many think that if everybody does what the owner asked them to do, or the design plans and specifications say, and the project is a failure, they're likely to get another project from that client, unless they're forced to do low bid? Nobody's going to be happy. The definition, once we're moving into a relational approach, is satisfaction. By the way, that's satisfaction of all parties. I was doing an IPD kickoff yesterday, and the owner walked in, and the senior person, the owner, and said, and I want you to know it is really important for us that you all make a good profit. Opening statement, understanding that it's not only the owner's interest we're talking about for high performance, it's everybody's interest. In fact, you can't do it as just one person. You can see all the other things, segregated sequential in terms of project, moving to integrated concurrent. There's a really change in the way you actually think about, manage, operate, and structure projects when you're going to true high performance. So I guess one of the questions, comes out is, this is already great, but does it really work? Is there any evidence that shows this does anything better? By the way, if anyone wants to see if there's any evidence that shows that putting out something to lowest responsible bid actually produces lowest first cost, please send me the report. I've asked for that for 15 years. There's no data whatsoever. Zero. Zero data. In fact, there's a lot of, I can provide you with lots of examples to show why that's not true. It's just built into the way we think that if we have sufficient number of bids, somehow we've magically gotten the right price. No data. And by the way, I'm talking lowest first cost. I'm giving away life cycle. I'm giving away change orders. I'm giving away all that stuff. Still can't even prove it on lowest first cost. So let's look at collaboration. Does it work? Sorry about this text. It's too long. But I wanted you to at least see, this is some work that's done by Penn State, looking at about 360 projects and not specifically focusing on IPD versus other things. What they said is there's too many people who actually use these terms incorrectly, and as a result, they decided to restructure the way you look at it, and they graded projects basically on integration and collaboration. And what they said is that owner's project delivery strategy was critically important to the outcome of the project, statistically based upon all their research. And secondly, the project delivery strategies require cost transparency, open book, had more cohesive teams, lower average project growth, turnover experience was better, and building system quality was rated higher for cohesive teams. Strangely enough, cohesive teams were almost basically advanced design build, not bridging design build, but advanced design build and IPD projects. University of Minnesota, Renee Chang and some of the other people, actually Marco Allison, who's now working up with Chandos, who's involved in this as well, did a series of studies where they looked at people owners, contractors, and designers who had experience with IPD projects, and they asked them to take a look at how they viewed. I only put up by the way, you can get the full report, I think it's on ipda.ca, but I actually only put up the combined. There's slightly differences between the way designers, contractors, and owners look at this, all favorable, but some differences. If the gray line is it's no better and the reds are worse, if you look at that, the worst outcome is that cost and budget control was only 82 or 83% of the people said cost and budget control was better. That's the worst outcome. If you go to overall value delivered, it goes up to 90% of the people said that overall value delivered was better under an IPD approach than design bid build, design bid build, design build, or CM at risk. It's a remarkably strong thing. In fact, they've recently published a series of case studies, and the researchers, it's about 500 pages, it's long, but I think you can also get that either from University of Minnesota or from IPDA. when the researchers looked at it, they said, it's not even worth asking the question, does it work anymore? That's just, from an academic standpoint, why bother asking the question? There's too much data. We want to know why it works. And so their second research thing is called means and methods. What actually they think are the drivers that are causing this to actually occur. More recently, in 2016, the Lean Construction Institute had a study that was done by Dodge Data and Analytics. And the Dodge Data and Analytics data basically looked at 80 owners, 160 projects, different types of delivery systems, and they asked them to grade them on 5 basic criteria as what were their typical projects. By the way, typical projects for owners. Contractors and architects, when they're asked how satisfied owners are, grossly overestimate it. They say they're pretty happy, they like their projects. You ask owners, you don't get the same answer. So they asked owners, and the owners basically had their typical projects which were over budget, late, and did not perform well. There are also safety and another fifth thing I can't remember right now. And they said, what's your best project? And they did a comparison, and they looked at a whole series of things, including lean processes, if you want to look at them. But they also looked at project delivery systems. Orange is typical. 41% of their typical projects, i.e. bad projects, were design, bid, build. Interestingly enough, when you look at CM at risk, it doesn't get much better on failure, which really tells you if you do CM at risk and you don't have early contractor involvement and build in the collaboration tools, you really don't get anything out of CM at risk. It's just about as bad as design, bid, build. You do have the opportunity for better under CM at risk, though, because you can do those things if you try. But not everybody actually puts those features into the agreement. When you go to design build, which is not applicable for every project, not good for every project type, it starts looking different. But the real shocking thing is the least used project delivery system of all of them delivered 22% of the best projects, took a huge slice of the best projects, and only delivered 1% of the typical projects. That's an astonishing result. So their data, and as I said, their data came out and basically ended up showing the same thing. What this really tells you is the deeper you get towards collaboration, the closer you start changing your structures, the higher performance projects you're probably likely to have. Notice, in fact, that if you get to other types of project systems, yes, occasionally you'll get a winner. I don't think most serial builders really want an occasional winner. They want a winner this time, next time, the time after that. And we need a project delivery system that will do that. So one of those questions is, I know some of you here. I've worked with some of you on IPD projects, so they are here. They are not as many, obviously. They're not the most common project delivery system. But one of those questions that comes up is people say, well, this is a West Coast issue, or this happens someplace else, or this is only healthcare. By the way, it started in healthcare heavily in North America, and there's a lot of healthcare projects, but that's not really true, and it's not true anymore. If you actually look at projects, and this is, I was asked by the Pankow Foundation, which is a charitable organization created by a contractor to sponsor research in design and construction, to create an IPD guide, a guide for actually starting, commencing IPD projects. And I wanted this to be a North America thing, and so actually I invited IPDA to join. And so IPDA from Canada has actually been involved in this process as well. And we're thinking March this gets published, and it'll be free, by the way. It'll probably be on the IPDA website, and you'll be able to get it from there. But this is a chart which basically looks at the more things on this chart which are ticked high: technical innovation, creative innovation, other types of innovation, high sustainability, high value to budget, challenging schedule, clarity. There's an issue on how you deal with clarity, probability of change during the course of the project, complexity of the systems and interaction. The more things get checked in the high, the more you need to be in a collaborative project delivery system. You do not want to deliver that design bid build. You do not want to deliver that CM at risk unless you drive in a lot of pre-construction services. So where are we now? Yep, there's healthcare. We're doing hospitals all over the place. My furthest away hospital is in Norway, in Tønsberg. But we're also doing biotech pharma, both manufacturing, laboratory, office, across the United States and actually internationally. Data centers. We've done semiconductor manufacturing projects up to over like $2 billion. Higher education, universities. University of Waterloo, St. Jerome's University was one of the early IPD projects in Canada, quite successful. There's a lot of current there we are again. K-12 education projects going on currently. Edmonton Public School Board actually has projects here. Red Deer Catholic Regional School System has done projects here. There are projects, actually, other education projects going on. Entertainment, by that I mean major amusement park. Some of those projects are like $1.2, $1.3. We're not talking about small, some of them are smaller. Mixed-use projects currently, automobile manufacturing, non-critical nuclear. It's been announced that Canadian Nuclear Laboratories is doing an IPD project right now in Ontario. Process manufacturing, commercial, sustainable, showrooms. Okay, we're going to have to do this a little differently. Okay, then now that we've got the volume and I pick it up. Okay, airport facilities. All these different types of projects now are going IPD. Projects are the Fortune 50 or the Fortune 10. We're talking about some of the largest companies in the world are shifting to IPD systems. Now, some of you will say, well, yeah, that's not my market share, who cares? The important is not so much that you necessarily will work for those people, although some of you really like to, is it when they change, the market changes, the owners change, the industries change. Owners drive this kind of change, and when big owners make that move, the next thing you know is medium-sized owners make that move. The next thing you know is smaller owners make that move. They will change the industry. Now, some of you will also say, since I've just talked about a lot, we've talked a lot of big stuff that, in fact, it doesn't apply to smaller projects. That's sort of true, by the way. If you've never done an IPD project at all before, it's going to cost you time, effort, and money to figure out how to do it. And you probably need a project about $10 million to break even after you throw in all the extra costs of your first project. Second, third, and fourth costs don't need to be, if you've got the same team, don't need to be as high. We have one client that does projects that are $1.5 million on a repeat basis over and over and again with the same team, no problem. They do quite well. But it will take you some time and effort because IPD projects are very different in that you do a lot more work up front than you do in a traditional project, and so your burn rate is going to look. First time you go through it, you're going to hyperventilate because the burn rate in the first couple months is. We're doing all this organizational work. We're not doing real work. It turns out that that's the work that makes the real work efficient. So, but you just kind of have to hold your breath on that a little bit. Some resources. The only plug for the book. Integrating Project Delivery is currently probably the best text out there. It's available through Wiley. Cheapest place to get it is Amazon, by the way. For some reason, the price keeps going up and down there. But there's a lot of free information out there. In Canada, IPDA.ca has actually put a number of resources on their website that you can just download. Better yet, you can probably join them and get information as well. There is, I didn't put down Lean Construction Canada, but it's there too. The reason mostly is because leanconstruction.org, which is the US organization, has more resources on their website. But obviously, LCI Canada is a place to actually get involved. You'll find that people who are very heavily interested in collaboration are also very heavily interested in lean. Those two tend to go together, even though, in fact, they're theoretically different. We have a ton of stuff sitting on our own website. You can pull that stuff down if you want. That's all free, too. And as I said, this integrated project delivery and action guide for leaders should be out, I say spring because I know I've published enough to know things slip, but spring should be March, that it actually goes out, worst April. So those are all resources. So I think we have a little bit of time at the present. I have to look at the schedule. Is that correct? So what I was going to say is, what questions do you have? How does this all sound to you? Where do you want to where do you think any of this stuff could go? They could use it. No questions at all? Somebody has to at least, yeah. Who secures the team? That actually happens a number of different ways because in some instances an owner will have, for instance, a very strong relationship with a designer that they already have on board for really very, very early design, and so they may already be on board. You may actually, we've had that situation the opposite way where it's a construction manager that the owner has a close relationship. But then usually the procurement is something close to between a best value procurement and a quality-based selection procurement. Because what you really do is you focus on trying to create a team that both has the competence and the technical capability you want, the experience, but also you believe is capable of being collaborative. There is no design, so there cannot be a bid. That doesn't mean you don't look at some financial information. You might look at what that person's home office overhead rates are. You might look at some other things. But those are mostly, at that point in time, indicative to try to figure out roughly how things fit in the market, not bidding against each other. The critical thing is, can you put together a good team? Now, when we did St. Jerome's University, they did not have a pre-existing relationship that they wanted to particularly use. And so the RFP that went out there was for a full team. So we asked for a design and construction team to actually show up and say, this is the team down through to the trades that we would propose for your project. And so it was actually an RFP for a complete design and construction team. It was almost like a design-build RFP, the depth it was going. And that's pretty common. I've never seen anything close to a hard bid IPD project because it makes no sense. Other questions? Yeah.
Howard, if people in our market don't have experience with IPD, and that's qualification in the process, how might they manage that challenge?
They get the chicken and find the egg. No, the problem, if you stop and think about it, at some point in time, nobody had experience in IPD. Now, when we get responses to RFPs, now we get a few people who've got IPD experience, mostly who don't. And the people who don't say, I'm not going to be competitive because I can't check that box. Completely wrong. We've chosen teams that do not have IPD experience over somebody who actually does. In part because what we're looking for is your ability to collaborate. So if you can talk about how you worked on a design-build project closely with the designers, how you worked if you're using building information modeling, how you actually interacted and handled shop drawings, handled information within inside a model, how you actually did these things, how you actually worked in a big room and how you actually functioned. If you can look at some of the individual elements we're looking for, that's good. What you don't want to do, by the way, and this happens a lot, is we'll talk to people and they'll say, collaboration, it's in our DNA. We've always, for 45 years, we've done exactly what you're talking about. There's a little checkbox in the upper right-hand corner of an RFP evaluation. You don't see it, it's not printed, but it's marked clueless. And it just got checked. We now realize that person has no idea what they're talking about. So don't do that. Talk about what you've really done and how that can model in this thing, and that's what we're looking for. and show us the people that are actually, you can tell from the way I'm phrasing, I often represent owners. Show us the people who are going to do the work. Show us how they can work together. We had a project a while back. The #1 rated team walked in, and we started doing the interviews. We asked questions, and we asked a question of the contractor, who immediately looked at the architect and kind of go, "What? I don't know who's going to answer that question," like that. And it got really strange, and so we kind of said, this isn't working. And especially when we got into the contract negotiation, we said, let's look at Team 2. Team 2 walked in, and you've heard the old story about Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire, essentially. You know, she's doing everything in high heels, and she's doing it backwards when they're dancing. These people danced. You asked a design question, and the contractor answered it. The architect said, well, that's how we're going to deal with the budget issue. I mean, they were fluid. They were very fluid, and they were very comfortable working together. Bang, we hired them. By the way, that project, LEED Platinum, under budget, delivered, according to the client, about 20% more value than their traditional projects. Really neat projects in Waltham, Massachusetts. So you don't have to have the experience, but don't try to fake it either. Talk about what your true collaborative experience is. Yeah?
During the construction process.
Okay, the question, if you didn't hear it, was how do you protect the public interest if, in fact, one of the major parties goes into default during the IPD process? And the answer, in part, is you very closely vet the people that go into the IPD agreement, and there is a lot of financial transparency. Depending upon the size and the importance of the project, we will actually, at some point, learn an awful lot about how people run their businesses, what their resources are, and what the availability. First time you do that to some people, they go, oh my God, I've never shown that to anyone. I will tell you, in the end, we all look the same. We all have 2 arms, 2 legs. There isn't that much difference that you think. Once people have done the projects, they recognize they can deal with the transparency. So you do transparency, you do validation. If you've got a specific key critical sub that cannot be easily replaced, then there is sometimes we actually do something close to a bond, but that's usually like for a curtain wall that can't be, you can't swap curtain walls very easily if they go, but it's pretty rare. And that kind of a default situation, default at the prime level, is a really, really rare and actually fairly easily handled with inside the IPD. Default at the lower levels, kicking somebody off the island, is not that tough. Yes?
Howard, what's been your experience with in-house counsel for public sector owners? Are they an impediment at times to the owner interest in IPD? And if that is the case, have you developed resources to work with and educate in-house counsel?
The answer is yes, yes, and maybe. By the way, large corporations are almost exactly the same issue. Their in-house counsel have been trained to protect. By the way, that doesn't mean to actually have the project be successful. There's a different definition. Lawyers' concept of protect is I put something on a piece of paper that's supposed to protect you. If that really worked, we would never have an overrun on a public project. Stop and think about that. My experience with with attorneys in the public sector varies widely. I had a number of them who have become they're obviously watching out for the important things that the public sector has to do and the various statutes they have to comply with, but they're also very interested in project delivery. And I've also had some who sort of said, this is different, we don't do different. I don't care what it is, I don't care what the date is, we don't do different. I've had that, and what my experience, though, is what that really means is we have a time delay, because usually we can work past that, but it takes a lot longer because there's a big education process that has to happen. But that's, by the way, not any different when you're talking in the largest corporations in the world. They have very similar legal structures to most public agencies, and they have internal rules that they don't like to bend, and so you actually have to work through that too. But usually it's a question of time, not a question of binary. We can't or we can't. It'll take longer to get through that process. Yes?
Speaking from a public owner perspective and looking at building a significant rehab program over the next 5, 8, 10 years, can you speak to this use in a rehab situation, maybe as opposed to what I would assume, and everyone is maybe assuming, is a new build?
It's significantly better. We've done historical, one of the first IPD projects I did was in a historical building, rehabbing it. We had to meet all kinds of historical requirements, but it was also, it went to LEED Platinum and did a number of other things. One of those things is when you're doing renovation work, you're going to find things out that you didn't expect. And if you're in a lump sum bid type situation, it's change order city. That's what how those projects just run with change order conflict constantly. If you're in a highly flexible system, you have a team that can basically adapt to the situation. We're also doing, I don't know if any of you have read any of the Dan Brown, and I'm not, by the way, pushing the Dan Brown novels, but like the Da Vinci Code. They also did one called The Lost Symbol, all about Masonic symbology. The building that everything happens in is a 1916 architectural treasure being renovated IPD. Okay, and it's a project which is, there are no straight lines anywhere, or at least the walls don't stack. It's an incredibly complicated project, but you need a team that can investigate, respond, come up with solutions, back and forth, at the lowest price you can do it, the most efficient way to do it. So I actually think it works very well for renovations. Someone else?
You've dealt with a lot of cities, states, and the federal governments. And lots of times these governments have a lot of internal influences and external influences in how they run their projects. So they live in a culture of fear. What is it that you see helps them make changes? Is it the political side or is the administrative side that usually pushes them to make these changes?
What I've seen there really is kind of two things. Sometimes that there's a champion at a middle-high level, high enough that they can get away with it if they don't talk too loudly. And these projects will kind of start under the radar as pilot projects. And then once they're successful, they've got something to work with. I've also seen some instances where someone fairly senior in the organization recognizes that they've got a challenge. They have to deliver so many schools. They have to do this. They have to do something, and they know they can't do it traditionally. And that's kind of a burning platform situation, and then they're willing to try something different to actually make it happen. On the other hand, we've also run into situations where it has taken years for them to come to that conclusion. There's an organization now that I think is undertaking some of its first public IPD projects. I think first time I taught, and I'm not involved in them, by the way, my first discussions with them might have been 4 years ago about it as a possibility, and it's slowly taken that long to percolate. So it varies, but a lot of times it's a champion, a pilot project, and a pressing need that will start forcing people to make change. Question.
Yes.
So I think he's got it first because he's got the microphone, but you're next.
Thank you. Could you comment on how you manage Miller Act compliance down there? We don't have a Miller Act, as you're probably aware, in Canada, except that in Ontario, they've just passed mandatory bonding legislation for publicly funded projects. So in that sense, it's quite similar to Miller Act situations in the U.S. So I'm just wondering how you manage that, in the U.S. right now, because we don't know.
To be fully honest, the United States, the federal government, does not have the ability to do, or they don't think they do, to do pure IPD. So they have to do some, GSA does some interim things that somewhat like it. But where we do have situations where we have mandatory bonding requirements, and we get the bond. I mean, that's what we do. We may think it's a waste of money in that instance, but we get the bond. And we have found that there are sureties that if once you set the target cost in the first place, the first services that are going to happen on an IPD project are services. And so usually the bonding requirement doesn't happen until you actually have the equivalent of a construction contract. So what is at the time that the target cost is set and we're starting to move forward in construction, we will then procure a bond based upon the target cost, or maybe the target cost plus a little bit, target cost plus the profit amount, and we'll get it bonded, but we mostly think it's a waste of money. Oh, that depends on what in that instance, usually what we're doing is we're getting it depends on the structure of the IPD agreement. It can either be a three-party or a contract which has almost an infinite number of parties. And they're bonding their obligation under that contract. That means they're bonding it actually to the owner as who they're bonding it to. But we try to avoid it when possible because, as I said, most of the time we don't think there's value. The bigger issue is how do you deal with lien holdbacks in Alberta? And bottom line is the statute says there's a lien holdback. There's a lien holdback, folks. There's no magic answer. Wait a minute, this lady right here was next.
A quick question with the Moose Jaw Hospital was done as an IPD as the first health hospital in
Correct.
Canada. Is there any lessons learned and what was the result of it? And is there a hospital in the States that would be a good example as well to research?
There's tons of hospitals in the United States. Moose Jaw, I know a little bit about, but I was not involved in the Moose Jaw project. So what I can tell you is really rumor, and maybe that's not fair to the people who were there in case somebody's rumor was slanted. So maybe, I don't really want to say up front, I'll tell you what the rumors are later. Essentially that it started off very, very well. And I don't really know how quite it finished. But I will tell you that, I'll give you an example of a project, $320 million project in Augusta, Maine. Believe it or not, they do have snow in Augusta, Maine. That project had 4 estimates of cost and schedule to meet a certificate of need process that the state of Maine required. So we had a really good idea what it would take under CM at risk to deliver that project. It went IPD. There was a funding problem and the project lost the summer start and ended up having to start drilling the piers late in fall. They then ran into more rock than they anticipated and had a significant problem with the differing site condition. As a result, this project finished 10 months early from being a CM at risk project, even though it basically got kicked by 2 or 3 months at the beginning of the project, in part because of a very close collaborative relationship between the structural engineer and the steel fabricator. By the way, they delivered $50 million roughly of extra value at no cost. That was built out of savings in the project, and it's considered the best hospital in that particular area. But the Sutter Health System has about an $8 billion program delivered up almost entirely IPD. It's a huge number of Sutter Health projects. I have 5 hospitals on the Eastern Seaboard right now that we're working on. There's a lot of hospital experience. There's more hospital experience than anything else. Very, very successful with hospitals because they're very complex structures. And they have a lot of interwoven parts, so IPD is extremely good for healthcare. Yeah.
Howard, time for just one more quick question.
Okay.
Actually, that was a great prelude to what my question is just curious to know how successful you've been with IPD on the services outside of the building in servicing, site grading, landscaping.
That actually question came up yesterday, and it's mixed. We're doing the Performing Arts Center at Brown University, and it's right in the middle of the campus. So the landscape architecture and the civil components are key to how that building actually functions and how people flow in and out. So from that standpoint, they're on the team and they're really important and they're really integral. On the other hand, if you're building a stick building out in the middle of nowhere on an absolutely flat site with no real big problems, you may actually put the civil work outside the IPD agreement so that they can finish, be done, and gone. So you actually look at the level of integration between civil and landscape and the project to decide whether they're in the agreement as part of it or not, and we've done it both ways. Performing Arts Center is a good example of one where we have them integrated. I think that's the official end of time last question, so thank you very much, and I'll be around for a while if someone's talking.
Great, man. Okay. You're doing a great job.